As a villain, I actually really enjoyed Yhwach. I found him to be compelling, with a great design that both inspired terror and also gave him incredible screen presence. Perhaps most importantly of all, however, I thought he was a fitting villain for the final stretch of Bleach's story, with enough historical context to be a very important character while wielding immeasurable power, making him a worthy world-ending threat for the end of Bleach. And yet, despite all that, when I think of villains in Bleach, the one I always go back to is Aizen. And yeah, of course, if you've watched any of my content before, you'll know that I'm a massive, unapologetic Aizen fan. And yet I just couldn't help but wonder what Kubo's plans for the character were going to be when he inevitably brought him back. And of course, when he does bring him back around chapter 617, I was ecstatic to see what Kubo had in mind for the former main villain of the series, maybe even taking up the mantle of main bad guy himself once again after Yhwach had been dealt with. And for a time, I really felt like that was still going to be the case, and it seems to me like there are a couple of instances in the final arc involving Aizen that seem to hint at a different future for the character than the one we got. A future where maybe he tried to achieve his goals of defeating the Soul King and sitting on the throne of heaven once again. Now, of course, we know how Bleach actually ended. We know that Kubo was suffering from several health issues that meant that he had to speed up the 1,000-Year Blood War arc and potentially cut a bit out and make the arc shorter than it was originally intended to be, and I can't help but wonder if Aizen's role was greatly diminished as a result. In this video, I want to take a brief look at just some of those instances where I think Kubo was maybe hinting at something more for Aizen, building towards giving him a more exciting and satisfying conclusion to his story than just simply going back to prison. Before we begin this video, guys, if you haven't subscribed yet and you are a Bleach fan, make sure to hit that button now for more videos like this in your sub box every single week. And if you did enjoy the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up because it really does support me and helps me out with the whole YouTube algorithm and exposure on YouTube as well. And if you want to take that support from me a step further, you can become a channel member now just by hitting the join button down below. And it helps me out more than you could possibly know. So why did I think that Aizen had a chance at becoming the main bad guy again? It is a bit weird. It does seem like by the time the Vandenreich have rolled around, Aizen's time has been and gone, and at the moment he is a bit player in a much bigger war. And yeah, Yhwach has everything you need for a final bad guy. He is the closest thing to an actual god we have ever seen in this series, but even without godhood, he is a king who commands a colossal empire of Quincy's attempting to bring down the Soul Society. That's pretty good final boss material as far as I'm concerned. And yet Aizen was always there, lurking in the shadows. Kubo never killed him off, and he just instead remained in prison, awaiting the day it seemed inevitable that he would finally return to the series. And if you ask me, as someone who loves Aizen's character, I just can never imagine Aizen being the kind of guy to be content with his loss like that and just to sit in prison and accept his due for the rest of time. It always seems to me like he would be constantly scheming, constantly plotting, finding ways to undermine the Soul Society and undermine everyone around him. We know he has no love for the Quincy's. That is made evident in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc and perfectly in keeping with his character. I can't imagine him wanting Yhwach on the throne, wanting the Soul Society to be destroyed. That makes total sense. However, at the same time, I don't think Aizen would just happily give up his conquest of the Royal Realm because he happened to lose. There's hundreds of years of planning gone into this. So that's why when he finally did return nearly 200 chapters after his imprisonment, I was expecting him to maybe take up the mantle of the final bad guy once again. And like I said, this is all speculation, but it does make sense to me. Back in chapter 423, when Aizen is defeated and we see him imprisoned in Muken during his trial in the Central 46, a really great scene that I think Kubo included to show us that the Aizen we all knew and loved still existed after Deicide. But it's a really nice scene, but it also, in my opinion, painted a picture of someone who was not happy with the outcome of the battle and was not likely to just sit there and allow it to happen. He was going to plan and scheme for as long as he was imprisoned. As you guys know, Kubo conveys so much emotion through close-ups of characters' facial features, whether that's the mouth to emphasize a sort of creepy factor, or the eyes to emphasize something else. The last time we ever see Aizen before his hiatus in Bleach is a close-up of his eye with real sinister shadowing on it, really implying to me that he is not finished here. He has more work to do as the villain. And then, of course, we don't see him for nearly 200 chapters, but he is mentioned in the Thousand Year Blood War arc constantly, and we know that Yhwach goes and speaks with him and deals with him at the end of the first invasion, and this is when Aizen puts Yhwach under his spell. So already Aizen is still scheming and carrying out plans, looking to undermine both the Quincy's and maybe the Shinigami too. But unfortunately that never materialises. Now the first moment when I was reading it weekly where I really thought Kubo was hinting at Aizen returning to prominence as the main bad guy happens in chapter 618 in volume 68, and this is just after Aizen has returned to the series. I mean, literally, Kyoraku is still talking to him in Muken at this point. And of course, the conversation between Aizen and Kyoraku is fantastic. Two of my favourite characters in a room together is pretty much exactly what I want from Bleach. However, in chapter 618, Kyoraku is essentially trying to find a way to get Aizen to fight for them, to help them against Yhwach, and Aizen is pretty reticent to help them, although he does seem maybe like he's just stringing Kyoraku along a little bit. Now, in the Viz manga, so essentially my official translation, Kyoraku mentions to Aizen basically saying, like, do you want to get out of here? You know, kind of throwing it down on the table. Do you want to get out of here? I'm not asking you to fight for the Soul Society. But then he says to Aizen, I'm not asking you to fight for the Soul Society, I just figured we shared similar interests. And after that, Aizen kind of says, you know, he pauses for a minute and he's just like, you really are you're an amusing man. And you get like another close-up of Aizen's eye, where Kyoraku, he has kind of underestimated him. And we know that Kyoraku is dark, he's underhanded, especially in this arc, and he's not above breaking the law, essentially, to get what he wants. Now, in another translation I saw prior to reading this one, he says something similar to that. He says, I just believed that we were at a point in time where our interests were about to intersect. Now, what this could mean, it could be as simple as, you don't want the Soul Society to be destroyed, I don't want the Soul Society to be destroyed either. It could be as simple as that. However, I think there's a little bit more to it than that, and I kind of always have as well. I think that Kyoraku is more talking to Aizen from a perspective of, you once wanted to kill the Soul King, now I need to kill the Soul King as well. I need a Soul King who is not going to absolutely just annihilate all three worlds, because at this point Yhwach is in the royal palace, he is fighting the king, and I think Kyoraku's well aware the king is about to be killed. That's why Kamikake is being set up with Ukitake. That's why Ukitake says to him, you allowed them access to the royal palace, and Kyoraku's like, well, you know, we couldn't really help it, but, you know, we've got these contingencies in place. And Aizen is one such contingency, I think, for Yhwach becoming the Soul King, which is essentially what happens. And Aizen's response here is very telling to me as well. Something else we have to talk about here is the question of Aizen's ultimate motivation. And he has been presented with numerous motivations throughout the course of Bleach. Right at the end of the series, and I mean right at the end of the series, as he's about to start fighting Yhwach, we get essentially his final motivation that Kubo tries to use for him deciding to help the Soul Society, I think. And that's essentially where he says that Yhwach says that defeating me is not in your best interests, and Aizen says my best interests are just about crushing those who would try and rule over me. It's a very simplistic motivation, and it's Aizen's character reduced to the most base level. And if you ask me, I have never really bought this as a motivation, purely because I think all this is Kubo obviously ran out of time because of his health issues and whatnot, and he just had to try and sum up Aizen's reasonings in one line, basically. But we know there is more to Aizen than that. He doesn't just want to kill the Soul King because he doesn't like the idea of someone ruling over him. He thinks the Soul King is an abomination. He thinks that the status quo needs to be reorganized. As he says to Kisuke, you know, that is how a loser thinks. A winner would think not of how the world is, but how the world should be. Aizen's there's more to Aizen than just, I don't like people ruling me. There is more to him than that. He has always been about just destabilizing the status quo. Aizen's not someone who sees himself as a villain. You know, he doesn't just hate authority. He wants to change Soul Society forever. He doesn't like that it's being ruled by an abomination. So this idea that Aizen just wants to kill Yhwach because I don't like people ruling me is very reductive, I think, and it is Isen's motivation reduced to its most base level because Kubo had to write something because the series was ending in 5 chapters. We also know that Aizen himself, from perhaps his most pivotal and important scene ever towards the end of the Soul Society arc, does actually want to rule. He mentions that the throne is vacant and that he will sit upon it. That's his ultimate goal, is to kill the Soul King and take the throne for himself. So it really isn't too far-fetched to me to believe that Kyoraku wanted to get Aizen out of prison so that he could take the throne instead of Yhwach. Kyoraku knows that Aizen wants the throne, and he's like, you know what, we can deal with that better than we can with someone who wants genocide, essentially. And like I said earlier, Kyoraku is very underhanded. This is the same guy who said that I don't believe using evil to defeat evil is itself an evil act. This is the same guy who was prepared to restrict Ichigo's movements because of his immeasurable power and keep him trapped in the Soul Society. Kyoraku is very much the big picture. He's willing to do whatever it takes to win, and that's what makes him so fascinating. And I absolutely believe that Kyoraku would happily play to Aizen's ambitions if it meant getting Aizen on side. And perhaps the last piece of evidence that we really have, or at least I think it's evidence, like I said, this whole video is speculation at the end of the day, but it comes from chapter 624, and this is after Aizen has returned and met up with all the Shinigami again, and he's used Hado 90 to destroy the Soul King's Reiatsu that's coming down upon them. This is his major contribution to this part of the war. Obviously, later on, he actually fights Yhwach, but right now, this at least appears to be why Kyoraku has set him free. And we then get a fascinating couple of pages between Kyoraku and Aizen as they are basically looking on as the Shinigami and the Quincy are coming together to try and create a doorway to the palace. And we get a really nice moment from Aizen as he kind of looks at this and he's like, oh, Quincy and Shinigami coming together. And Kyoraku's basically like, that's not really what's happening. What's really happening is, the enemy above, everyone kind of chased after you, essentially. The enemy has become what you wanted to be. And now everyone's just coming together to stop him, and they're all going up to the royal palace to do so. And we get this fascinating moment from Aizen, which I do not understand why it would be included in the story if it wasn't hinting at him being the main villain. And so Aizen is just sort of, sitting in his chair, and he muses to himself. He says, oh, I see, so that's right, the one who stopped me has now actually entered the royal palace before me. You truly are still insufferable, Kurosaki Ichigo, and you get this really sinister look on Aizen's face that screams revenge to me. And I remember turning the page as he said that, and I was like, he's going to be the main bad guy again. Or at the very least, he's going to turn against Ichigo at some point in the future and try and achieve his goals again, because he's clearly incredibly unhappy still about the loss he suffered to Ichigo and the fact that now everyone is in the royal palace apart from him, apparently. And like I said, Kubo, again, using eyes, using mouths to really convey hidden feelings, hidden meanings, and you get the idea, the sense that Aizen is still seething at the fact that he lost to Ichigo in the Arrancar arc. And to me, it just really felt like he was going to be the final bad guy after that, or at the very least that he would do something to undermine the good guys, perhaps once Yhwach had been safely dealt with. Of course, that doesn't come to fruition, and instead Aizen does just help them in the final battle against Yhwach, which in itself is really cool, to be fair. You do get a truly great Aizen moment when he reveals everything's an illusion. That's a really nice moment for Aizen. But unfortunately, after that, he just goes back to prison, and then that's the end of his story. Apparently, he's just happily locked away again with no real struggle, which again doesn't really feel right to me. It doesn't really sit right. But that's what happens. And this was, again, like I said, before we got Can't Fear Your Own World. This was before we got that nice little scene with Aizen and Hisagi. This is just what we had back in the day when the manga came out. We had to just accept that Aizen was put back in prison without even so much as a struggle. So that's just it, really. That's the speculation video, just kind of looking at a couple of scenes where I really feel like it's kind of hinted that Aizen might have been at least planned to have some kind of extra role in the final arc. perhaps beyond Yhwach arc. After Yhwach arc had been dealt with, Aizen was maybe then going to rise up and try and become the Soul King again. I could have absolutely seen that happening if Kubo had maybe had more time. But unfortunately, you know, like I said, I'm happy we got to see Aizen at all. Before we end the video, I just want to bring up something else briefly. I think maybe deserves its own discussion down the line. But this is, like I mentioned earlier, Aizen is given numerous motivations throughout the series. And the only one that I have never truly bought is the motivation that Ichigo believes about Aizen at the end of the Arrancar arc, and that's, he says that he locked blades with him and he just felt loneliness. And then Ichigo himself speculates that maybe Aizen wished to lose his own power through the Hogyoku. And I've never bought that to be true. I don't think he's right, and I think it's hinted that he is wrong as well, because after Ichigo says that, Kisuke doesn't say anything, and he just instead gives him this like side-eye look, which is always implied to me that Kisuke doesn't think Ichigo's right and just doesn't want to say anything to him about it. But we know that Kisuke knows the true Aizen. Turn Back the Pendulum shows you everything that Aizen is. Aizen's entire character can be summed up in that line in Turn Back the Pendulum where he says, the betrayal you can see is trivial. What's truly frightening is the betrayal you don't see. And just the idea that this guy wants to lose his power so he can essentially have friends is nonsense to me, and it always has been nonsense, and it doesn't really make any sense for the character. Like, in my opinion, Aizen makes his ambitions very clear at the end of the Soul Society arc, setting him up to be the villain throughout all of the Arrancar arc. And this, you know, the same, so basically he was saying he's happy to just be in prison now, and that's it. I've never really bought that. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. Like I said, this is probably for a bigger video down the line. But that motivation has never sat well with me, and I think I've always felt you're supposed to think Ichigo's not quite on the mark there, because of the way Kisuke kind of looks at him afterwards, and we know that Kisuke knows Aizen better than Ichigo. So, I don't know, that's just my thinking. Personally, that's just never made sense to me, and in my opinion, it doesn't really jive with the Aizen we know at all. Alright, but that's really it for this video, guys. It really was just a speculation video. These are just my thoughts and opinions based on what I've gleaned from the manga. Let me know in the comments below if you think I'm completely off the mark and if you interpreted Aizen's role in the final arc differently to me. Even if you do interpret it differently, do you think Kubo had additional plans for Aizen that he had to cut short because of his illness and all that sort of thing? Let me know in the comments below. I would be absolutely fascinated to hear. Alright guys, but until next time, I'll catch you later. I'll see you then.